Hi, I'm Missy with On William Street, and this month we are ready for B block number 4. So if you have not joined us with what we're doing, we are doing a skill builder online quilting bee. So you can check out all of the details on our website and you can get caught up. But we are working through every month this year a different skill. So we're going to take the skills that we already know, or maybe that we don't know very well, and we want to hone in them and we want to perfect them. So we want to really spend time on these blocks. That's why we're only doing one a month, so that we can really perfect those skills and just have better quilts in the end. So for this month we are doing half square triangles. So in the quilting world, a half square triangle is referred to as an HST. So if you're not part of the quilting world, if you're new to quilting, if you see anything out there that says HST, that just means half square triangles. And half square triangles are one of my favorite blocks. They're just so versatile and you can do so much with them. So we are going to do 2 different ways that you can do half square triangles. There are a lot of different ways out there that you can do half square triangles, and we actually do have more of those ways in a half square triangle guide that we have put together, and you can access that through our subscriber library. So if you've subscribed to our newsletters, you can get that through the subscriber library. If you haven't subscribed to our newsletters, subscribe to our newsletters, and then you can get access to that half square triangle guide. So for this block, these are the fabric amounts that we're going to need. So for the half square triangles themselves, we're going to need from our white, our dark green, and our light green, we're going to need 2 7-inch blocks of each. So that'll take care of one method of our half square triangles. And then for our second method, this will be the yellow, the light green, and the dark green. And you're going to need 4 of each of these, and they are cut at 3.5 inches square. So those are going to be the 2 methods for our triangles themselves. And then to finish the block, you're also going to need some additional pieces. So we're going to need, for our center of the block, we're going to need a gray square, and this one is 5 inches square. And then we've got some light green and some dark green that are smaller squares, and they are 2 3/4 inches. So make sure you get the 2 3/4, not 2.5. 2 3/4 inch squares. And then we also have 2 sets of strips. Oh, and sorry, there are 4 of each of these. And then 2 sets of strips. Again, there are 4 of each of these. So we're going to start off with the simpler of the 2 methods. So for this method, this is going to bring in our yellow star in the center. So you're going to want to match a yellow 3.5 inch square up with each of the green squares. So we've got 2 with the dark green and 2 with the light green. And what we're going to do is we're going to put them on our mat, and we're going to go ahead and measure them. This is a 2 half square triangle method. So match up those edges, and then you're just going to measure. Put your ruler on from that corner to corner, and we're going to draw a line. So I'm using a fabric heat erase pen for this. You could also use a pencil for this if you don't have something that is a fabric pen, but I am using this one. Is specifically made for fabric. And then we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam on each side of that line, and that's going to give us our 2 half square triangles. So let's go ahead and mark the rest of these, and then we'll move over to the machine. So now what we're going to do, like I said, we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam on each side of that line. So this is something that you're going to want to make sure, if you don't have the little line on your sewing machine on your foot to help guide you down, you're going to want to make sure that you take some tape or something and put that down, so that, because this is going to hide underneath your block and you're not going to see it quite as well. So this is actually something in another video that we did, is checking your 1/4 inch seam to make sure that you have a true 1/4 inch seam, and we talked about putting some tape down. So that's something that you could refer back to if you would like to, if you don't have that mark on your foot itself to help you make sure that you get that 1/4 inch. But we do have this little mark on our foot, so we can go ahead and use it. Whoops, lost the pedal. And then for this, you actually don't even need to clip your thread. You can just pull it up and then put it down again and go down that second side. And then this is actually also really nice for chain piecing because again, we can just stick our next block in there and keep going. Now that our blocks are sewn, we need to go ahead and cut on this line that we drew, and that's going to take those squares and it's going to give us 2 half square triangles per block section, and then we will trim them up. And there's 2 ways that you can do the trimming. So my preferred method is the pre-iron way. To me, this is easier. There are some people that say this isn't always going to give you the exact measurements. I've never had any problems with it. So this is my preferred method. So we need to have these blocks need to be 2 3/4 inches unfinished. So I actually have this square up ruler that I love, and so it's got the lines on here. So it's got 1 1/2, and then it's got the single lines. But so we're just gonna have to use these because it also has our additional lines on there. So what you do for this is we're going to take our 2 3/4 inch mark right here, so these little red marks, and we're going to put that right along the seam on our triangle, and then that will show us what we need to trim off to get that square. Now we can take it over to the iron, press it open, and we've got our 2 3/4 inch square. So the other way that I'm going to show you, we actually do need to press it first, so we're going to go ahead and press that, and then I'll show you how to trim it up. So the second method of trimming these is using just our regular ruler, and we can use that 45-degree angle line to make sure that our seam is lined up just right, because we don't want to end up cutting too much off this side and then not having things line up. So when we line that up, we're going to make sure that we've got enough space on both sides to cut those. So we'll cut just a little bit off this side. Turn our mat around. Actually, do I have enough space to turn it still and see? I do. Then we want to make sure that we're lining this up on that 3/4 inch line. Trim that side up, and then we can turn the square over and do the same thing on this side. So then the 45-degree line on the other direction, you want to make sure that right up here, your top, the end of your green, where your green and yellow meet, you want to make sure that that's right there at that line so that things will line up correctly in your square afterwards when you put it all together. So flip it around. And then right here, when we line this all up on our 3/4 inch, 2 3/4 inch line, see our 45-degree angle line is right there on the seam, and our corners are matching up right there in the corner like they should. Okay, for our second group of half square triangles, we're actually going to do 8 at a time. So we've got our light green, we're going to match a light green and a white together, and then a dark green and a white together, and then also a dark green to a light green. So let's start off with our light green and our white. So again, we're going to start off the same way we did with the smaller ones. We're going to layer them on top of each other. And we are going to draw a line from corner to corner again in one direction. Then we're going to move it around and do the same thing in the other direction. So this is one of those instances where I love having a rotating cutting mat, because then I don't have to pick up the fabric and move it around and have it move on me. So this comes in handy. So then once we take this over to the sewing machine, we are again going to sew a 1/4 inch seam on each side of both of these lines. And then when we get to the cutting, we're actually going to do a little bit of extra cutting to get our 8 triangles. So we had our first one, so our white and our light green, and then we're also going to do a light green and a dark green combination, and then a dark green and a white combination. So those are going to be the 3 different combinations that we'll use for this set of triangles. So now for our larger blocks, what we're going to do again is just like what we did on our smaller blocks. We're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam on this side of the line, a 1/4 inch seam on this side of the line, and then we're going to take the other line and do the same thing. So a 1/4 inch seam on each side of those lines as well. So we've gone down one side, we're going to pick it up, flip it over, go down the other side, and then we'll cut our thread and move over to the other line and do a 1/4 inch seam on each side of that line. So for this one, we're going to do it just a little bit differently on the cutting. So we're still going to cut along this line, but we're going to do another cut first. So because I want to do this other cut first because I'm going to have these lines even after I cut it up, but this I won't have. So we're going to need to measure in 3.5 inches. So this is our 7-inch square. So we want to make sure that we're measuring in 3.5 inches, and that should line us right up along those seams and where that line meets. And we're going to cut down the center. And then we're going to turn our block, and we're going to do the same thing on this side. Line it up with our 3.5 inch marks. And then we're going to cut again right there down the center. Okay, and then we can go ahead and cut along our lines, and that is going to give us our 8 half square triangles. Okay, we have all of our triangles cut out, and then we're going to go ahead and trim these up the same way. So again, so we want to have these blocks to be 2 3/4 inch unfinished. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and lay out our block, and we're going to start with our 5-inch gray square right there in the center, and then we're going to take our yellow and green half square triangles, and we're going to lay them out. So what we're creating is a little bit of a star slash snowflake look with this. So we're going to lay our yellows out. We want to have the yellow line up this way. So we want to have our yellows touching in the center when we add both of our greens. So you've got the greens in the center, I guess the yellows on the outside, and they're touching right here in this center. So we've got, want to alternate these on each side. Oops. Oh my goodness, this is why we lay it out. Make sure that we get them all in the right direction, because I messed a couple up, didn't I? Yes, I did. Thank you. Okay, so yes, this is why we want to make sure we lay out our block so we know what the finished block is going to look like. So we have those. Then we're going to take our solid squares that we have, and we're going to put them on top of the color that they match. So our dark green and then our light green. And then we're going to bring in the rest of our half square triangles. Okay, so now we're going to start with our other squares. So I'm going to start off first with our light green, dark green mix, and we're going to place them right here in these corners. And you're going to want to have this light green up next to this dark green up next to the light green, so that again they're alternating all the way through. And we're actually going to need 2 of those, but on a diagonal. So we're going to lay these out. And then this is where we bring in the ones that we matched with the whites. So we're going to put one here. So we're creating our line all the way up with our dark green. And then also our dark green and our white, we want to bring it up here so we're finishing up this section. And then the same with our white and our light green. And then the last pieces that we're going to lay out are our strips. So these are going to go in these edges just to have everything finish up the square. So we're going to lay these out. And then that is going to finish up our full square. And then we're actually going to sew these together in sections. So I'm going to start off with this section, and this section, and then we can sew the row and then again finish up there. So we're going to go through each of these sections, but if you've got space to keep it all laid out, I would recommend just keeping them all laid out so you don't have to reorganize them. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with this section. And one of the things that we're really trying to do with this half square triangle builder is making sure that we're lining up all of our edges and we're keeping our points. So one of the things that I always like to do is I like to make sure that I have some pins on hand. So when I line up my two edges, I want to make sure that the edge is all lined up right there along each other. We're going to pin these together and sew them, and then again with this one. And then when you're sewing these two sections to each other, what I like to do is nest the seams. This is going to help when you're sewing those together. So when you iron them, iron one to one direction and then iron this one the other direction, and then when you bring those two pieces together, those seams are going to nest up, and it's going to help you keep those points right there in the center exactly where you want them to be. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these up, and then we'll show you how those points really match up. Okay, so I've got these ironed. As I mentioned, I ironed them going the two different directions. So this one's going this direction, this one's going this direction. So then when we put those two seams together, they're going to nest right up next to each other. And this is going to help us as we then sew this last seam to really make sure that those points are lining up exactly where we want them to be. You can still use some pins if you would like to, just to make sure that the edges are lined up, but this is really going to help you get those nice, neat points. So now to finish this section, we're going to go ahead and we're going to take this shorter piece. We're going to sew it right along this edge. And then after we iron these out, we're going to take this piece and we're going to sew it along this longer edge. And then that's going to finish out this section. And then you can just repeat that same process for the other three corner sections. Okay, so this section is complete and we are ready to move on to the next section. So one other thing to remember that we want to make sure that we touch on with this block, especially this block in particular, is your 1/4 inch seam. You need to make sure that your 1/4 inch seam is a true 1/4 inch seam. Otherwise your points are not going to end up lining up like you want them to get this whole finished piece. So make sure that you double check and make sure that your 1/4 inch seam is definitely good to go. So now we're going to move over to this middle section and sew it together. And we're going to sew these two blocks together, these two together, and these two together. And then you can just sew those 3 rows to each other. And this one is going to be a little bit easier because we don't have quite as many corners to line up as we did on this one. So go ahead and sew each of those seams, and then we'll come back and sew them together. So now that we've got our rows sewn to each other, we now have them separated out into 3 sections. So then we're going to go ahead and we're going to take this section to this, and we want to make sure that these lines line up nicely. And as you can see, we ironed that so that we can nest those seams right there again. And then we're going to take this section and line it up to this section, and you want to just make sure that your greens and your lines are matching up nicely. And then after that is complete, we'll go ahead and repeat this process for the other 4 sections that match this as well. Now that we've got our 3 sections all sewn together, we are going to then sew these 3 rows to each other, and then our block is finished. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to flip this over, sew this one together, and then sew this one together. And I promise there is an end in sight with this block. It has a lot of pieces to it, so it does take a little more time. That's why we give you a whole month to do just one block. We're all finished. It is complete. All of these little half square triangles sewn together really make for a striking block. So a couple of tips to remember: take it slow. Don't rush yourself. It is a lot of little squares, so it takes a little more time to sew together. Pins are your friend. We used a pin on every single seam, so don't be afraid to use your pins so that you can help get those points really lined up, and then just keep an eye on your 1/4 inch seam. So you want to make sure that you do have a true 1/4 inch seam, and it's going to make all of these points line up so much easier. And don't forget to post your pictures as you're finishing them. Tag the online Quilting Bee 2020 is our hashtag that we're using for this, and so that we can see your progress and how you're doing, and we will see you next week.